Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your producer and host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we chat with energy experts from all around the world. We exchange on timely energy issues as well on their life experience. You will learn a lot whether you are an energy aficionado or a newbie. And one of my favorite part of the podcast is when guests share about their personal trajectories. I always find it authentic and inspiring. It's September 25, 2020, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today I'm exchanging with Amy Jaffe, a leading expert on the geopolitics of oil, gas, energy policy, and sustainability. Amy recently joined the Fletcher School at Tufts University as a research professor and managing director of the Climate Policy Lab. She previously held positions at the Council of Foreign Relations, Rice University, and University of California, Davis. We will discuss timely US-China energy relations, or rather US-China energy competition right now, and Amy's unique adaptive professional path from reporting to academics and think tanks. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Leslie. Great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining. And let's delve directly into the topic of the day, which is the US elections are coming up, and all eyes are on the US-China competition and what possibly a Biden administration would do differently or a Trump administration would do or continue doing. So can you give us a little bit of status of the relationship right now when it comes to energy? It seems that on the fossil fuel side, there could be complementary in the relationship between the US is increasingly a big producer, exporter of oil and gas, and China is hungry for all those resources, although they produce some of that. And on the renewable climate change situation, China seems to take a more advanced leadership than the US, I would say.
Well, it's a very complex landscape between the United States and China today, and I think it will improve a little bit if the U.S. election brings a changed administration. But some things are structural and hard to change. So the first step is the United States, of course, as you mentioned, has been a major exporter of oil and gas, and China has been one of the destinations. As the trade war heated up between the United States and China, energy exports from the United States to China got disrupted. Chinese refiners and Chinese importers of LNG actually stopped making purchases of United States commodities. And so we saw a lot of that oil and gas get diverted to other markets, and China bought from other markets. Now, China is an important import market. Even in crude today, China's rebuilding or expanding its strategic stocks of oil at a time when, of course, the oil prices are relatively low. And so it's a key market. And people believe that for liquefied natural gas, LNG, China is going to still be an important piece of the import market for those supplies. And so sort of the future of U.S. LNG export expansion hangs in the balance as to whether or not China will feel comfortable relying on U.S. exports. So, President Trump had made that sort of part and parcel of the trade deal that, China would buy a minimum amount of energy from the United States. Mm-hmm. My objective opinion is that actually by tangling energy into this trade negotiation, it actually messed up what would have been a natural progression of the market, which is a lot of the U.S. energy would have gone to China. It slowed down exports of LNG to China because, of course, you couldn't tie equity in LNG receiving export terminals to Chinese purchasers. So it really made the thing very complicated. It was, I think, pretty devastating to the U.S. natural gas industry.
Yeah.
Now, on renewables, it's again very interesting. President Trump put a tariff down on imported solar panels to try to help U.S. manufacturing. Well, where were those solar panels coming from? A lot of them were coming from China. And China has really dominated in solar, and they're also becoming a big player in wind. And so, the question becomes, how does that competition manifest itself over time? And we still have a lot of strong US companies in the clean tech space, and of course, in emerging clean tech technologies, whether that's going to be in the future hydrogen or in battery storage, of course, and how the United States and China manage that competition. So, are there tariffs? Aren't there tariffs? Does the United States put a restriction on certain kinds of technologies going to China, especially if it's digital? You have some dual use issues with some of these technologies. And then in addition, there's just the competitive aspect, which is, the United States is talking about, if Trump is reelected, we will, the United States, withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And that puts us off of all of the various committees and so forth. And so if we're going to compete in a future energy market that's going to be, dictated by some amount of energy transition, even if we don't do an energy transition quickly in the United States, it'll happen at least in the US and the blue states. It'll happen in Europe at a fast pace. It's happening at China, and it's going to be a big portion of China's next 5-year plan. And so, it does get into the whole just general US economic competitiveness, whether our companies will be well positioned in the global clean tech market or not, depending on what US policy is. Now, a Biden administration, I think, is going to emphasize clean tech as part of economic stimulus. And there's talk among people who advise the candidate about making hydrogen manufacturing. So something like electrolyzers that would take and make hydrogen from curtailed renewables like wind and solar is going to be, I think, a part of a Biden administration initiative. So, kind of an interesting area for the United States to take a position. If you look at the big plans for offshore deep water wind off of New England and down into the mid-Atlantic states to Virginia, electrolyzers that would produce hydrogen could be a big piece of that whole industry. And Massachusetts and other states are planning to have shipyards and places to build the blades and hold and transport the blades. So we were talking about a lot of industrial growth in renewables on the U.S. East Coast. Yeah. And so, a lot of potential here. And California, of course, just announced, and this again the fate of that will depend on the U.S. national elections, whether there's lawsuits or not lawsuits. California has announced its intention to ban new sales of internal combustion engine cars by 2035.
Mm-hmm. And how much China's drive towards decarbonization, and the Chinese government just announced to become carbon neutral by 2060, how much of that is driven by their ambition to become more independent from US oil and gas? We know that the abundance of US oil and gas has contributed a lot to lower oil and gas prices in recent years. But China is one of the main winners of this abundance of fuels and doesn't want to be basically hostage of this US oil and gas.
Well, listen, the reality is it's hard to do anything quickly. US oil and gas is an important part of the market. And so I think it's going to be, the Chinese can get oil and gas from some other location, but it just means that location is going to buy the US oil and gas. So I think the more important way of thinking about China's views, of course, they're concerned about, energy security for oil. But I think primarily for them, clean tech is an industrial policy. And it has an energy security part because, of course, to the extent that they can shift to renewables and work with resources that they produce in China or technologies they use for energy efficiency in China, that enhances their national security. So it's definitely part of the national security policy. China itself has announced its implementation plan, the whole plan for having at least on a think tank basis, the plan for how it is going to implement a ban on gasoline cars going forward to 2040. So they're serious about it. But it's really part of their industrial policy. They felt they couldn't compete in the international car market on the surface right away because they have no brand. They were new to the industry. But they felt that if they focused on electric vehicles where there was no leader yet, they could be a winner. And there are 100 substantial, EV companies in China. There were more, but there's, up to about 100 that have different models that are selling in China. If you're looking to buy EVs, I think in the future, China is going to be a major competitor. And of course, Tesla is doing very well in China. And we're seeing that reflected in their stock price in general. But they're going to find new competition over time in China from Chinese companies.
Yeah, and China already dominates lithium. The lithium chain which is the ingredient necessary for batteries for electric cars. Should the US be concerned, and is there an industrial policy in the US to try to counter that?
Well, the United States should be concerned because the Chinese don't control the raw supply of lithium. Some people talk about that. That's not really accurate. There's lithium in many different places, and the United States can support, lithium mining in other locales. I think the most critical thing is that the processing of lithium is really dominated in China. There aren't too many other places that have lithium processing facilities. The United States definitely wants to gear up with its own. And Europe, has been quick, more so than the United States, to jump on that understanding. And they have created a $1 trillion initiative that starts with including lithium processing. So definitely, there is going to be a competitive business internationally in recycling lithium, in processing lithium for batteries, and of course in batteries that don't use lithium. And the United States, the good news is the Congress has continued to keep our funding in place for clean energy RD&D. Probably next year or the year after, as the Chinese increase their spending in that area, they're going to come to equal the United States or perhaps even surpass us in the money spent in RD&D, in the clean tech space and in the battery space. So it's definitely an area where the United States needs to put more focus. And, California's policy could accelerate that. But if we get the federal government suing California and telling them they can't have a forward-looking policy, it does harm overall the whole economy. And it will hurt the American car companies. I mean, one of the problems we have is if you have a backward-looking car industry and we're not doing things to incent the car industry to compete in this new, world of advanced automobiles, we're going to be, caught on the back foot. And the interesting place where the United States is way ahead in vehicles is on autonomous vehicles technology. Yeah. And you've got big players talking about how when they go to these self-driving cars or robo-taxis or however you want to describe them on the ride-sharing basis, they're talking about having it, Uber's declared they're going to be all electric, and you've got others talking about being all electric. And the question is, who's going to manufacture all those vehicles? And are they going to be used in the United States, just in China? Who has access to which market? It's going to be a very interesting global landscape.
Yeah. And I read this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, "Appeasing China Won't Cool the Earth" by Walter Risselmed. And I found it interesting. Basically, it was saying to potentially the next Biden administration, if they win in November, that it wouldn't really make a difference by trying to persuade China to join in the international community on climate change by basically being weaker, like taking a weaker position on trade or intellectual property on other things, because this is something that China wants to do anyway. They are heading into curbing their emission. They are heading into green technology. And so it's, you don't need to appease China on other topics to bring them on the table of climate negotiations.
Yes. So I would expect the Biden administration will definitely want to rekindle the cooperation between the United States and China on global climate change. But my understanding is that this Biden team is not going to be swayed by the idea that China is going to close a few more coal plants or make a bigger commitment to stop financing coal internationally. And in exchange for that, the United States should not worry about, dual use technology transfer and IP theft. Like, that's not going to happen. It's very bipartisan in the United States, this concern about how China competes in technology. And there's an interest in having international ground rules, not only on intellectual property, which I think there are a lot of countries that have concerns, in addition to the United States, but also on these questions like cybersecurity. And so there's no question that there's certain aspects of the trade war. I mean, I'm sure the Biden administration will undo some of the policies that they do not believe were effective in managing trade between the United States and China. But that doesn't mean willy-nilly that the Biden team are not going to be concerned, or the Biden himself are not going to be concerned about the national security implications of some of China's actions when it comes to cyber, when it comes to security in Asia. I think the Chinese are going to find that there is a hardened position on China that is really pretty bipartisan, and the changing of the presidency is not going to overnight wipe those concerns out. There's still going to be a tougher policy than the Chinese saw under President Obama. And indeed, we now have the problem of the human rights issues with the Uyghurs. And, the left in the United States tends to be more concerned about the impact of human rights on global relations. So you might see even a larger concern about the Chinese beyond national security concerns to other kinds of concerns that have been a little more silent under the Trump administration. Though, in fairness, Secretary Pompeo has been sort of, at least rhetorically, active on the subject of what's happening in Western China.
Yeah. And do you think the Biden administration would be as adamant as the Trump administration in asking China to buy more US energy to reduce the trade deficit, or that would be dropped?
I just don't. I don't think that that's going to be the emphasis. I think that to criticize the Trump administration a little bit, the United States is a major economic power. We are not looking to become a raw material supplier to the world. And China doesn't recognize, well, actually they do recognize, because it's happened more recently. They're having up their purchases to new record levels. The United States has strategic advantage in the fact that we have a strong food industry and we have a strong agricultural sector. And China is in need of those products. And same thing with our oil and gas industry. Right now the sector is under pressure because of prices, but we have a lot of resource potential, and we have some really strong technology, and we have the ability to have higher environmental performance if we had the right standards, which I think the Biden administration would put in. So, I think that what I would imagine, and if we have a different presidency going forward after into 2021, is that you would see maybe a de-emphasis on positioning the United States as a commodity supplier and thinking more strategically, following on to some of the good things the Trump administration's done about how to reinvigorate the U.S. manufacturing sector to have us be competitive in some of these areas like clean energy and other areas like biotech.
Yeah. Let me ask you, we mentioned earlier hydrogen. Is there a pioneer advantage, like a first mover advantage for government to go ahead and implement a strategy now? Like we see that the EU has released the hydrogen strategy. Why is it important?
Oh, it's very important. Hydrogen is looking like it's going to be an enabling technology for seasonality for renewables, right? Mm-hmm. So, you have a battery and that can help you for 24 hours or that can help you on a limited basis. But, when you get to wintertime and other kinds of fluctuations, hydrogen's a very enabling technology. And also, it's a technology where during the transition, Europe is already working on this, where you can use some of your existing infrastructure if you have a well-maintained natural gas pipeline system, as they do in parts of the UK and elsewhere in Europe. You can inject this hydrogen into the pipeline system. Mm-hmm. And that's being produced from electrolyzers offshore wind. We're seeing Shell make plans in the Netherlands to do this. And then you can inject it. You don't even you can build a dedicated hydrogen pipeline, but that's expensive. If you have well-maintained natural gas system, you can blend in the hydrogen, and then you have two choices. You can either have a cleaner, quote unquote, natural gas because part of it's coming from a hydrogen stream, or you can separate the hydrogen back out and use it as a fuel for heavy industry or vehicles or so forth. So
and the first mover kind of control the standards, right? Like can decide first on the regulatory and standardization of the industry.
Well, I think it's also first mover, like the same way with the Chinese with solar panels. Mm-hmm. Like if all the electrolyzers for hydrogen are manufactured in the United States and hydrogen storage canisters or trucks or whatever, if it's all manufactured here in the United States and we built up a big industry around wind in New England or wind in the Midwest, then we're going to be the first mover and everybody's going to buy our products the same way Tesla had an advantage. And I like to remind people that in the 2009 stimulus, Tesla got $400-something million to open their manufacturing factory in Fremont, and that's what got them going. And now they're a premier international brand with more manufacturing. So it's first mover is a critical advantage. And if we just lag behind and we say, oh yeah, but someday we'll be able to export our LNG again when the market comes back, that's not a forward-looking strategy. We already have the LNG. The forward-looking strategy is to think about how to integrate hydrogen. How could the United States position itself to be the leader in hydrogen? How can we position ourselves to be the leader in batteries, right? I mean, we're already behind the 8 ball. We have the advantage that we have Tesla's an American company. In solar, we have still First Solar and a few good companies, but the Chinese have overtaken us in a lot of these areas, and their companies are now ranked, in even in batteries. It used to be that the United States and Japan were among the top 10 companies in solar and among the top 10 companies in batteries. And, that's really changed in the last 10 years.
Yeah. So, Amy, let's move to your personal trajectory. You recently took on a new position, and it seems that your professional path has been influenced by what's happening in the energy market. Can you tell us a little bit? You started with more like a reporting job on oil, and you evolved to include different kind of energy expertise, and now you're more doing towards climate sustainability. And tell us also a little bit what you're going to do at the lab at the Fletcher School.
So I think the important thing when people think about their career and their career trajectory is that you want to be a lifetime learner. You don't want to have studied one thing and that's all you do, and you do that for 50 years. And, if the need for it goes down, you become unemployable. Like, that's not a good career trajectory.
It's not a good business
So,
plan. Yeah.
right. So, what did I study in university? I studied Arabic and Middle East politics in university, and scholarship and so forth, the history of the region, and the geopolitics of the region. And, it was a big interest of mine. And as you know, I first career was as a reporter, a journalist, writing about those kind of topics. And then I became a professor, writing about those topics. But somewhere along the way, it became more and more clear to me, first as a journalist, actually, and then later as an academic, that the same kind of geopolitics that was influencing oil markets through history was going to happen in natural gas as we went to more and more LNG. Natural gas was going to become more geopolitical. And indeed, when I was the director of research at Rice University's Baker Institute, we did a big study together with Harvard University on the geopolitics of natural gas. And, and we had also done a study on that, come to think of it, with Stanford as well, both of which led to major publications. So I had pivoted to that. But then, as the years went on, I started to see that climate change and alternative energy and carbon pricing were going to become a bigger piece of how energy was going to be bought and sold and created and traded in the future. And so, I had to learn along with my students more and more about clean energy. So, first initiative was at Rice. I worked together with our Department of Chemistry to do a big research program on how nanotechnology and new material science was going to influence what was going to be possible in clean energy in the future, and then moved on to go out to the University of California, where I worked on a variety of topics. First and foremost, looking at the fuel system. And I used to like to tell my students, not all students are receptive to this, that if you're trying to work on cleaner fuels, the first step to working on cleaner fuels is to understand the logistics of oil and gas fuels. Right. And so a lot of people don't want to do that. They just want to study clean tech. They don't want to dirty their hands, understanding how gasoline is manufactured and distributed, or how natural gas is distributed. But in thinking about the transition, if you don't understand the incumbent and what infrastructure advantages the incumbent has, or the cost of that infrastructure compared to new infrastructure, you're not going to get the right answer. So went out to California and worked on that successfully with the state. And one of the things I think a big insight that my research brought during that time was that more emphasis needed to be put on the freight sector, that we need to look at heavy wheeler, 18-wheeler trucks, and how we're going to make them more sustainable. That was going to be a big growth in oil demand. My point was, those trucks turn over every 3 years. Some of us own a car for a decade or more. It's hard to get EVs into the system. But when trucks turn over every 3 years, if you have a sustainable truck policy, you can have a lot of impact quickly. Right.
And just fast track right now, because we're running a little bit out of time. So right now your focus is going to be more on climate and energy transition. Yeah.
So now I'm 100% focused, not necessarily deeping dive on one particular sector like transport as I did in California, but more broadly on the energy transition, how do both private companies and governments achieve net zero by 2050. And looking at, I'm specifically, our center looks widely at assisting governments with their national plans for energy transition and decarbonization, and also climate resilience.
Very interesting. You said states or cities or?
No. So we work with governments, national governments. We started with China and India and increasingly Ethiopia. But I think we'll be expanding to work with more governments in Latin America and Africa over time. And then we, and of course the US government, but then also My particular specialty, as you know, from the course of my career, is really to look at what do private companies do, and how do governments intersect
Right.
with the private sector to propel, whether that's through public-private partnerships or
Yeah.
other kinds of ways to incent the private sector or regulate the private sector to be a constructive player in the transition. And then also, I think looking at the national oil company sector and what's going to be happening in oil producing states, and how will they respond to the energy transition.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Amy. It was really good talking to you and learning from your experience. And I hope we'll continue the discussion.
Look forward to talking again soon, Leslie.
Thanks. That concludes our Energy Vista podcast, which was recorded on September 25, 2020. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.